This is Einstein, of course. This is Virginia Woolf. They're my examples of two prototypical creators. Einstein, of course, a physicist, Virginia Woolf, a writer. If you're going to be a creator, it's probably better to be a writer because writers can continue to be creative for the rest of their lives. Scientists, especially when they're quite young. But of course, nobody cared what Einstein looked like when he was 25 because he wasn't Einstein. He was Albert. And since the creating mind is the theme of this symposium, let me say a bit more about it. Creating is a word that's very much in the air everywhere. Creativity, innovation, thinking outside the box. Everybody has heard these things ad nauseum. And I don't have a radically different way of, well, I guess I do a radically different way of thinking about creativity, except I'm used to it, so it's not so radically different for me anymore. An idea or a person is creative if he or she does something new, which eventually affects how other people think and act. So you do something new, it's novel, but that's not enough. It also has to ultimately have an impact on what other people do. Now, of course, what Einstein and Virginia Woolf did had enormous impact. There are what my colleagues call middle C and little c creativity as compared to big C creativity. But that's what creativity is. Creativity, and I'm not even sure how Niel stands on this, to me, it doesn't have a particular connection to the arts. One can be creative or not creative in any sphere. Indeed, one of the problems with Wall Street the last 10 years was much too creative. But scientists can be creative, architects can be creative, mathematicians, lawyers. Creativity is simply coming up with something new which has influence. And many artists are not particularly creative. They're derivative, or they do what they do is novel, but it doesn't affect anybody. It doesn't get saved, doesn't get preserved, doesn't get posted. So creativity, we may think of it as having a particular affinity to the arts, but in fact, it's a use of mind which can occur in any domain or in any profession. It also, and since I'm in an American and West bashing mood these days, and if you read Robert Reich, he'll push you in that direction. It is something that's been much more common in the West over the last several centuries than the East. We have encouraged innovation, we've encouraged thinking new, we've rewarded people with breakthroughs, whereas until very recently in Asia, this was discouraged and punished. So much so that when I was young, centuries ago, people would come to two stories. One, they would come to my office from Korea or China or Taiwan or Hong Kong or Singapore, and they say, "We want to be creative like you. Please tell us the 23 things we should do in order." I said, let's just take the photograph. But the other thing is that people with a creative impulse in those countries had to leave and come to the West. And the West is Australia as much as Canada and the United States, a place influenced by Western thought because it was seen as being such an improper thing to challenge your teacher and mentor that you couldn't be in the same space with them anymore. That's over. Sort of thing that Thomas Friedman would say to our times. That's over, people. That's over. The ideas of creativity are everywhere. In India and China, every bit as rampant as they are here. But this doesn't mean, again, this may be a little tension with my friend Niel, it doesn't mean that we need to focus more on creativity in our schools. Because I think the message of creativity is everywhere. The real trick in our schools is how to wed the creative impulse to discipline and synthesizing on the one hand, and how to make sure the creativity is used for positive purposes and effects on the other. Let me repeat this. If there's one sentence you can take out of this morning and you can go to sleep, it's this one. how do we connect the discipline in synthesizing to the creative sphere? Because, and this is the one memorable line in the book, being creative is thinking outside the box, but you can't think outside the box unless you're the box. And the box is the discipline you've developed and the synthesizing you've done. And even Mark Zuckerberg, and I haven't seen the movie, had to spend 10 years mastering computing before he could create Facebook. You cannot end run that discipline. But, so this is a long sentence. Creativity on one hand involves building on your discipline and your synthesizing. And start early, so you have more time. But the other hand, and this is my sermon since I'm here in the pulpit, using the creativity for positive ends. That's what good work enterprise is about. Osama bin Laden is incredibly creative on every dimension that I can think of. But we don't particularly like the way he manifests his creativity. So, two other points about your topic, our topic, creating. Number one, I used to think that creativity was all about cognition. In the book I wrote called Creating Minds, I chose people who had different intelligences, like Picasso and T.S. Eliot and Gandhi, to show they were creative in different ways. But what I since have become convinced of is probably at least as important, if not more important, is the kind of temperament and personality you have. Creative people like to take chances, like to take risks, expect things aren't always going to work out, and when they do, they pick themselves up and try something new. They may momentarily kick the dog or yell at the children or the parents, but they don't get hung up on it because they expect that not everything's going to work. And in my study of creativity, the most inspiring line that I ran into was from Jean Monnet, who was the French economist who created the European Union. He said, I regard every defeat as an opportunity. And we've all read a lot about entrepreneurs. I do not at all have an entrepreneurial personality and temperament, but it's clear entrepreneurs expect to fail and they don't make a big deal out of it. They go and try something else. And you know, Silicon Valley and Seattle and Beaverton and places like that have their share of that kind of temperament and personality. And the other thing is part of that definition that I gave earlier. Nothing is creative or non-creative in itself. Nobody is creative or non-creative in herself. Nobody's mother or father can decide that you're creative or not. The only thing that counts is whether it affects other people. And if you're lucky, it affects people right away, and that's why Mark Zuckerberg is a zillionaire. But we learned that Emily Dickinson and Van Gogh and Bach were creative years after they died, because it was only at that time that other people were affected by what they had created. So I spend more time on that because that was my assignment. Now I'll give you the elevator speech. Depth, breadth, and stretch. Discipline means going deeply into at least one subject, profession, domain, craft. Breadth means gathering lots and lots of information, being able to synthesize it, and creating is going beyond rather than that. So that's the first three kinds of minds. And as a cognitive psychologist by training, that's what I've been trained to study and think about and write about. But the other two kinds of minds, the respectful mind and the ethical mind, are the ones that I've been very preoccupied with of late, in the last 15 years. And I think in no wise are they less important. In no wise are they less the assignment of school and other educating institutions, and perhaps they're even more important. Respect is easier to explain than ethics, so I'm going to spend more time on ethics. The respectful mind basically means treat other people with respect. It's not as easy as it sounds, because we basically evolved to know about 150 people, most of whom look like us and were related to us. And even your great-grandparents lived often in an environment like that. But now, of course, we all live in incredibly diverse environments, and because of globalization and the digital media, we are potentially the country of everybody on the planet. And what's our choices? We can try to kill them all. The people at the Pentagon would prefer that. We can hold our nose and tolerate them, and there are many people in America growing every day, number who think that. Or we can try to understand them and get along with them and hope that the same thing will happen the other way. That's what the respectful mind is about. The nice thing about the respectful mind is it's observable since birth. Every infant can see how adults treat one another, how adults treat kids, how kids treat one another. I can go to any school in the West and I can tell quite quickly whether there's a respectful atmosphere there. And it's not if a fuss is made about me, it's what's happening when nobody's looking. So respect is an easy concept, but it doesn't mean that we see it very much. I think that President Obama aspired to create a more respectful environment, and I think he failed. It's not over yet, but there's deep, abiding disrespect in public, on public platforms and the media in this country. It's very, very bad. You get no credit if you kiss up on Cape Town. This is a well-known American phenomenon, though Germany certainly knows it as well, where you're nice and respectful to people who have power over you, but you don't give the time of day or are willfully nasty to people over whom you have dominion. Making jokes about groups. I've certainly made them, I've certainly laughed at them. Not a good idea. It breeds disrespect. Tolerance is better than intolerance, but it's not enough. And then, and I've been guilty of this too, I'll respect you, but if and only 25 conditions. Respect involves a certain amount of charity, though at a certain point people do lose the right to be respected, and it's not something we should gratuitously withhold. Fortunately, and I don't want this talk to be entirely bad news talk, there are positive examples of efforts to rebuild respect around the world. There are commissions in peace and reconciliation which bring together victims and victimizers and try to get them to think about what happened, and if forgiveness, if the requests for forgiveness seem to be genuine and are supported by genuine actions, then people go on and move on. And it's happened in Ireland and countries in Africa and so on. I think that some of the music, the games, other kinds of cultural activities are a inviting milieu for people who come from different backgrounds to work together to begin to understand one another and so on. And I guess the two that I know about the Middle Eastern Orchestra started some years ago, and Yo-Yo Ma's Silk Road Project, which is quite an ambitious effort to show the many things that diverse cultures have in common and how they can essentially perform and understand one another better. But we've got a lot to learn about respect, and putting on talk radio is not going to get you there.